Okay, for this video lecture, I want to talk about language, which is a foundational, fundamental element of culture, which you've already talked about. Culture is the totality of all learned, shared, socially transmitted knowledge, customs, symbols, and behavior. And we've already talked about some things in class as far as culture being a very large part of what we study in sociology, constantly changing, constantly adapting. But language is a critical element, and it is really what distinguishes humans from other species. So it's definitely worth focusing on for a little bit. I've already talked about some basic elements of cultures, such as norms and values. Norms are particularly worth repeating a little bit here because we refer back to them quite a bit during the class. A norm is a standard rule of behavior that's maintained by society about how things should be or how things ought to be. Values are the overall collective concepts about what is good or right or desirable in our society. For example, respect for your elders is a value of our society, of how we treat them. And then a norm, and this could actually be respect for women as far as some old traditions of chivalry and things like that. So opening the door for a less able person or an elderly person, or even men opening the door for a woman, that would be a norm of society. And those norms could be shifting and changing as we speak. So language is the foundational element, and we'll talk a bit about how it kind of evolved as an abstract system of words and their meanings. And of course, we'll talk about the nonverbal parts of language as well, as that's certainly a critical part of our communication, are the nonverbal gestures, expressions, and the images that we give. So let's back up a little bit. This is a history lesson of the development of culture. And so we can go all the way back to 6 million years where the human, the Homo sapien, the original ancestors, the hominid line, we diverged from the other primates. And took a few million years. And you can imagine what could occur over a few million years when you look back and see how much society has changed just in the last 20 years. Well, a lot happened over the next 3.5 million years where we were no longer tree dwellers. We stood upright. We could see further and be more aware of our dangers. We were able to use our hands, our feet. And so around 2.5 million years ago, we start to see evidence of making tools. So there's some element of cognitive development there, is that we're able to use our hands to make these necessary things. And so therefore our brain is growing as a result as well. And then about 1.5 million years or so, see the innovation of fire, which does lots of things for us. It helps us to eat meat, which gives us more protein. It literally takes more effort off of chewing, less effort off of digesting, so therefore more of your biological systems are used for brain development. So cooking did a lot for our taking us to the next level. It also led to more social interaction of living and eating and meeting around the fire, and that increased social interaction also started to develop our brains. So therefore the Homo sapiens that had diverged away from the primates are really starting to see dramatic differences in brain development over this time. And the development of language occurred in this period here between this bracket here between fire and our link to common ancestors. So in this period right here, I'll get to in a minute, as far as when we started to develop language. But about 150,000 years ago, DNA has traced all humans to common ancestors, and then we migrated out from there And there's different theories as to how early humans started to migrate out of the central area of Africa. May have been earlier, but the Ice Age lowered water levels, had land masses more connected, ice bridges connected, places more to allow for better facilitation of migration. And within 100,000 years or so, human beings had migrated throughout the world. And around 50,000 years ago, this was sometimes referred to as the Great Leap Forward, to where we start to see that the language that we've developed, which I'll talk about here in a minute, really suggests that our brains are really being genetically reorganized into thinking human beings. And also around this time, we start to see the appearance of a lot more artifacts, weapons, and tools, needles and thread, paintings, jewelry, fashions, even rituals. In other words, we start to see cultures starting to develop around this time. And as we'll talk about here in a minute, the development of language is more than likely what kicked us into the overdrive to being fully human. Around 10,000 years ago, the Ice Age ended, sea levels rose, and therefore we became quite a bit more separated by geography and climate, and so therefore we separated in our own separate cultures. We constructed our own divisions of race, things like that, which we'll talk about more later on in later classes. So as far as the history of human language goes, around that time that I was talking about, perhaps as much as 1.5 million years ago, we were still using fairly primitive call systems to get our points across. And as we get into this period, our hunter-gatherer ancestors spent about a quarter of their day on social interaction. Much of this is what we would call grooming. And so this vocal grooming evolves in order to bond groups together. So our hunter-gatherer ancestors were relatively small groups of this extended kin, and so they would bond into these groups. That's why we are a very groupish species, and that we depend on social interaction and kind of forming like-minded groups and things like that. And this is a fairly interesting theory, is that vocalizations began to acquire a meaning over this time, and this took a long time, and it was mostly through this social interaction. In other words, gossip. Who's doing what, who's where, all this kind of stuff, just like we do today. Very important for us to talk about other people, know what's going on. So this gossip, so to speak, is kind of a foundational element of how we were motivated to try to communicate with each other. And it took, of course, theories vary, but it took about 400,000 years for some symbolic language to come about that was capable of making references to abstract concepts. So you can imagine how many generations this took in order to develop this. And therefore, as we see, it kind of perhaps culminates around 50,000 years ago when the Cultural Revolution begins, where there's a fairly strong consensus, I would say, that once we learned how to communicate with each other, then consciousness really fully kicked in, and we became fully human at that point. And then that's just where we start to see even more refined tool making, painting, even more signs of ritualistic behavior that we're doing in our groups. All right, so let's talk about a couple of other things here. This is when you look at core vocabulary, there's only a few 100 terms that are likely to be named in all languages. So that means we've got a lot of supplemental language out from that, because there's a lot of basic things that all languages have to designate. And today there's around 6,000 languages around the world, but much in the same way that we've all descended from the same common ancestors, well, it's most likely that all of our language, and this is studied by linguists to see what the commonalities are, so it's most likely that it descended from a single ancestral tongue, also in the same region of southern Africa. But it's interesting that other things that we have to develop and innovate came up out a result of this language. For example, counting of numbers is not necessarily innate to us, but it's dependent on our ability to be able to communicate with each other. And this is what anthropologists, they found a tribe that could not count above 4, and they had no signs for numbers. So therefore, their lack of ability to communicate numbers, and therefore they had no system of numbers. Now, what is fairly important is that humans have evolved over a long period of time to be able to develop what is referred to as a language instinct. It's part of what makes us human, and we are very susceptible and thirsty for learning the language at a very early age. By comparison, dogs do not learn to wag their tails. This is an inherent trait for dogs to express themselves, whether perking up their ears, wagging their tail, and this is part of their underlying genetic code. Well, it's interesting that the human's instinct to learn language of the group of which they're socialized into is also very important. And this is also referred to as neuroplasticity, and where it allows children to pick up new skills easier, particularly language skills. That's why it's comparatively easier to learn a language when you're very young rather than when you're already adult, you've already been socialized into a language, and then trying to learn another one is comparatively difficult. So this is just something that's inherent to humans, because developing a language is really what made us human. So it's a system of symbols that stand for things, actions, ideas, and enables us to transmit and store information, which literally is what made cultures possible, is that this is what we did, look at what we did, and now we can share this. And as I will probably talk about here and there throughout the course, is that our ability to read and write, and then the ability to print that information and share it with other people, and then I'm talking specifically pre-Enlightenment era around the 1400s or so, that's really what kicked us into our next level of human development, where we really picked up the ability to learn, to calculate, and to really use reason and rationality and introspection in order to solve problems. So non-humans have a very direct connection between a sound and its meaning. So for example, 60 sounds equals 60 meanings. However, human languages have a relatively small number of sounds that can produce almost an endless variety of words and meanings. So that gives us tremendous advantage over other species, and so you can see how that has led to our development of conscious thought that has kicked us into what we are now. Every culture has different things that they've been socialized into that have different meanings. For example, in Germany, there's a vocabulary of more 70 words to describe the various traits of beer, because beer is very central to their culture. Another interesting hypothesis, the language that you're socialized into really affects your perception of the world, time, space, and matter. So people who speak in different languages, they actually understand the world in different ways, which is what makes communication between cultures somewhat difficult when it's, even though you may be telling them exactly what you think and making it as clear as you think you possibly can, they may understand it in a different way. Aborigines, talking about in Australia, have no word for left or right. And I guess you could imagine that if you lived out in a very um, desolate area where there really is no left, right, back and forth, it's just all open space. Well, you could see how there might not be a word for that because there's no references to say that, oh well, that's left and that's right. You just looking out there at directions in all different ways. So non-verbally, about 2/3 of communication comes from non-verbal cues, and we also put a lot of importance on artifacts such as what we wear, what we adorn ourselves with, and so these are part of our nonverbal cues, and a lot is expressed through nonverbal cues. This is one of the, and I'm dealing with this right this minute. This is one of the challenges of online teaching, is that you're not getting the full depth of my nonverbal communication by just hearing my voice and reading the words. So that does have a distinction. And there's just lots of nonverbal symbols that we have out there in the world that convey a lot of meaning without having to say anything. Now this is just shows you how diverse the study of this stuff is because these are terms that I would not ask on a test. It just shows you the variety of study. Haptics, looking at the study of touch, chronemics, study of how time is used to communicate, proximus, the study of how we use space in kinesics, study of body movement and facial expressions, and for example, a smile is one of those universal human traits, but means different things in different cultures. So looking at some more comparative numbers here, there's approximately 6,500 languages in the world, but half of them are under the threat of extinction. And so we have the power rule in effect here. 95% of the world's languages are only spoken by 5% of the world's population. So that means there's a lot of languages out there that are just kind of lingering on in very small groups. So about 1/3 of the world's languages have fewer than 1,000 people who speak them. And so this is an interesting debate as to people's preserving their culture, but yet having to deal with assimilation and the fact that it's the value or the need for the use of their language may be waning in order for perhaps even just efficiency. And so that's a continuing debate when we're looking at studies of cultures and how they evolve, how they shift and change, and in some cases they disappear. Now, as far as looking into new evolving cultural phenomenon, text speak, we are in the digital age where we make ample use of textees, and I would clearly agree that there's probably some efficiencies and some advantages to weeding out a lot of the redundancy of the English language in the way we have developed our words. Clearly, English has a lot of exceptions to the rules. And then, of course, the linguists would study this as to what effect is it having on our literacy skills or our communication skills. I have looked up just recently a study that said that the students that engage in text speak, there's really no significant difference in their grammar tests that they were given. And so it still may be just a convenient form of communicating a little bit more quickly and efficiently, and still not be harming our general literacy skills. Is a formal communication skill, and then this would be an offshoot of that. But you could argue that we may be living in more of a communication age because of social media, not necessarily an information age. But if we're not careful, the speed that what we want for being able to contact people and be completely immersed and totally pervasive in the social media could lead to actually more misinterpretation. And of course, the internet is studied quite a bit for its costs as well as benefits. And so with the internet, we're facilitating a lot of behaviors that, again, the internet might not necessarily be causing these behaviors, but it could be facilitating behaviors in people who are so inclined, where gossip is meaner and faster on the internet, and it's literally created an entire industry of what we call trolling. There's also the ability to form groups into the vigilantes and the posse functions. The lack of face-to-face interaction creates more cyber courage for people to say things they wouldn't normally say. The reality form of entertainment and the YouTube culture, which I'm making ample use of. I'm using it right now, but it also has kind of changed the definition of notoriety or celebrity, that we can become famous without necessarily having marketable skills or without necessarily achieving anything. And then, of course, what we have to also be careful about is that untruths posted on this medium cannot be undone. They're going to be floating out there in cyberspace forever. Okay, one final thing. English-only movements through it. This movement has kind of waned over the years, but as we get into a new administration that really wants to focus more on anti-immigration, and so that's becoming a little bit more aware to the public, and so therefore more states may pick this back up of enacting English-only laws in their states, where English is actually made the official language in their state, and there's 31 states that have enacted that. And so this, in order to make English the national language, again, the United States Congress would have to do that, and there's been more than one attempt to make English the national language. And so you can certainly debate this as well. We'll talk about bilingualism here in a minute. But again, if you had to provide government services in all 322 languages that are spoken in the U.S., that would obviously be expensive and cumbersome. So then there has to be some practical unification there. And many anthropologists would suggest that when people talk about language, they are also talking about race. Now, of course, race is a social construction, and the promoters of English only assume that the difficulties of communication are caused by people speaking many languages. And as I've already said, though, even speaking the same language does not ensure effective communication. So this is something that perhaps assimilation, again, assimilation, when I talk about that, it's not in the context of being good, bad, right, or wrong. It's just something that happens. And we do see that people tend to assimilate into the major language for reasons of economics and efficiency. Critics also argue that English only would actually create more inequalities by making it literally structural requirement that you have just one language. So bilingualism, about 21% of the population speak English not their primary language. And we also see that students that are offered lessons in both languages show better progress. So now let's, as far as our sociological perspectives, you could say that functionalist perspective, language serves to unify people, and the immigrants will eventually assimilate into the dominant language for very rational reasons. From the conflict perspective, language is still a form of self-expression. Multicultural diversity is an asset. The United States has become a very powerful, developed, stable country with diversity, with multiculturalism as one of their interesting assets. And so I may ask this later, that how would you look at language or bilingualism? How would you explain that under the interactions perspective? Okay, so stay tuned for the discussion question, because you will need to respond to the discussion forum in order to get attendance for this class.